بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. Last week, a new study has been published by Columbia University, researchers who look into adolescent mental health. And subhanAllah, it's quite a surprising study for people who are advocating the benign nature of cannabis and weed. And actually, it's quite worrying and something which I've been advocating for myself, both from obviously an Islamic perspective as well as the mental health kind of adverse effects. The first thing to say is obviously as Muslims, whether something has a benefit or not, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has declared it haram, then that is what we follow. But obviously research evidence, and there's always hikmah behind Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's rulings. So when we think about drugs and alcohol, the harmful effects on mental and physical health, that's clear. The waters have been muddied recently with kind of the push to legalize cannabis in many states within the US, obviously Amsterdam, Holland, Canada, legalizing cannabis. And this is impacting kind of the perspective of young people, especially Muslims, about, what's the issue with smoking weed or smoking hash, because it's legalized. So the other important distinction to make is just because something is legalized does not mean that it's safe, okay? So I wanted to just briefly highlight the findings of this study, and I would encourage all of you to read it, inshallah, in more detail. It was published on the 5th of May, like I mentioned, by Columbia University, and it was published, the research was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. So what did they find? Well, they found that kind of the highlight or the main point to discuss is that recreational cannabis use, so use which does not meet the criteria for a disorder by adolescents or teens, is linked to a risk of depression and suicidality. Okay, so they found that teens who use cannabis recreationally are 2 to 4 times as likely to develop psychiatric disorders, including depression and suicidality, than those teenagers who don't use cannabis at all. So 2 to 4 times more likely, subhanAllah, that is significant, okay? They indicate that casual cannabis use puts teens at risk for problem behaviors, including poor academic performance, truancy, issues with the criminal justice system, and these can have long-term negative consequences that may keep young people from developing their full potential into adulthood. So one of the key researchers, his name's Ryan Soldan, MD. He's the assistant professor of clinical psychiatry in the Department of Psychiatry at Columbia, and is the lead study author. He quotes, or he says, quote, perceptions exist among youth, parents, and educators that casual cannabis use is benign. We were surprised to see that cannabis use had such strong associations to adverse mental health and life outcomes for teens who did not meet the criteria for having a substance use condition. So subhanAllah, even the lead author of the study was surprised. And the study, he said, is the first to identify that subclinical or non-disordered cannabis use. So that means that because when we assess patients with substance use, we have criteria that they have to meet to kind of be diagnosed with a formal disorder. So subclinical, as in those patients or young people in this case who do not meet the criteria. So symptoms and behavior that do not meet the criteria for clinical disorder has clear adverse and impairing associations for adolescents. So even patients who don't meet the criteria, they're at that risk. So roughly around 1 in 10 young people are defined as being recreational users. So to conduct the research, what the investigators do, basically they analyze responses from a representative sample of respondents to the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, which collects data on tobacco, alcohol, illicit drugs, and mental health annually. And this cross-sectional study included approximately 70,000 adolescents between the age of 12 to 17. So it's a massive study. 70,000, for those of you who know about studies, is a large sample size, okay? And the researchers, they found that more than 2.5 million US teens, or about 1 in 10, were casual cannabis users. And more than 600,000 teens, which is roughly 1 in 40, met the criteria for cannabis addiction. So the number of people that meet the criteria for a formal cannabis use disorder is very low, but the number of young people who are using cannabis recreationally is much higher. To be considered to have cannabis use disorder, an individual must meet at least 2 of 11 criteria, which include an inability to reduce consumption, constant cravings, and relationship and social problems. They also found that non-disordered cannabis users, so those who use it recreationally, were 2 to 2.5 times more likely to have adverse mental health outcomes and behavioral issues compared to those who didn't use cannabis at all. Teens with an addiction to cannabis were 3.5 to 4.5 times more likely to have these issues. Okay, so what about neurobiology and the effect of cannabis on the brain? So as you know, developmentally, the brain is developing in young people. So numerous studies highlight that cannabis use can alter the development of the cerebral cortex, which is basically the center of the brain for reasoning and executive functioning, so making wise decisions. This poses a risk to young people whose brains have not matured. Marijuana use in adolescence is associated with difficulty thinking, problem solving, and reduced memory, as well as a risk of long-term addiction. So Francis R. Levin, MD, who is basically professor of psychiatry at Columbia and a senior study author, said, quote, "Exposing developing brains to dependency, forming substances appears to prime the brain for being more susceptible to developing other forms of addiction later in life," end quote. SubhanAllah. So if you think about it from neurobiological perspective, and the term probably you heard of gateway drug, often people refer to cannabis or hash as gateway drug. So it kind of, as the brain is maturing and developing in young people, those who use substances like cannabis, it makes them much more susceptible to other forms of addiction later in life. And this is what we see clinically. So a lot of my patients who have opioid use disorders, so using heroin or crystal meth, they most of the time, yes, I would say majority of the time, started by using cannabis. Okay. Dr. Levin, who directs Columbia's Division of Substance Use Disorders, said mental health problems and cannabis use are closely linked. So he says, quote, "Having depression or suicidality may drive teens to use cannabis as a way to relieve their suffering." And she goes on to say that concurrently using cannabis likely worsens depressive and suicidal symptoms. End quote. So if you have depression and suicidality, using cannabis may worsen the symptoms. Okay, so like I touched on earlier, one of the problems we have within mental health is the growing legalization of recreational cannabis use, especially for those clinicians and doctors who are working in the US, Canada, and parts of Europe, like Holland. So the researchers said that findings are particularly concerning, given the popularity of cannabis as states have moved to make the drug legal. So as of April 2023, so last month, 22 states had legalized recreational marijuana, and 38 states allow the use of medical marijuana. And they say that this raises questions if the criteria used for establishing a diagnosis of a substance use disorder needs to be reevaluated for youth, said Dr. Sultan, who is also the medical director of Integrative Psych, where he specializes in substance use disorder treatment. So, quote, "While teenage cannabis use is illegal, even in states with legalized cannabis, there are little to no true protections for teens, such as educational campaigns." And he goes on to say, "Federal legalization offers the opportunity to address those safeguards," end quote. The researchers are continuing to this work by evaluating if adolescents' casual use of nicotine and alcohol by adolescents also demonstrates adverse impairing effects on brain function, mental health, and long-term addiction. Okay, so those were the highlights. I would encourage brothers and sisters for you to go ahead and read this study in the journal of the American Medical Association, published just this month. And it's subhanAllah, it kind of reaffirms and kind of confirms the risks of cannabis use and the challenge we have as clinicians, as educators, as parents, to fight against this push to legalize cannabis and this narrative that's been pushed by the media and other kind of lobbies that, oh, cannabis is safe and there's no issue. So we really need to work hard. We need to advocate. And subhanAllah, these are researchers who are very well established, and they publish this data. So we have strong research to back concerns about cannabis, putting aside, like I mentioned, the fact that it's haram. Okay. So I hope, inshallah, that was beneficial. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless all of you. And until next time, this is your brother, Dr. Abu Isa. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.